scene. I don't mean player in terms of like a literal esports competitor. I mean like tournament organizers, teams, other factors involved in it, media companies, is intellectual property rights, shortened IP rights. And we see particularly a current crop of titles such as League of Legends, Overwatch, where the game developer is incredibly hands-on and essentially controls the scene. Now, the reason why this is significant is because IP rights don't apply in the same way in the sporting world, which is obviously what people often think of as the closest analog to esports, hence the name esports. Because think of most popular sports in the world. So you've got like soccer, football in Europe, American football, obviously fantastically popular in North America, ice hockey, United States and Canada, but also a decent contingent in Europe, particularly obviously over in Russia. Basketball, semi-popular in Europe, getting bigger in China, massive in the USA, seems to be one of the fastest growing sports. Nobody owns these sports, as in controls them top down and has complete ownership and the rights to basketball, football, ice hockey. Even if there's a governing body or some top company that's at the top of a hegemony of other leagues and companies, you can still, if you want, operate some kind of a tournament or a team or game within those sports outside the boundaries and the rules and regulations of that governing body, and no one can legally stop you. There's no consequences, and there's definitely no way you'll be forced to just pay all the earnings you'd made from it to one person who comes along later and says, hey, you owe me that. Actually, I had the rights to that. But in esports, partly because it's a digital domain, and especially because you're essentially dealing using someone else's art to perform your action. It's like a subsection of someone else's art, which is their IP right. The game, the entire esports game, League of Legends, Overwatch, CSGO, Dota, Quake Champions, each of them is owned by a single entity, and they control effectively everything, even though in most cases they don't extend that control or assert that control. They do and can. Imagine the person who invented football or basketball. I'm talking about even just the ball. Now think about the person who invented the ball if they'd also invented the concept of the game. So how you have football like Naismith, or how basketball rather, obviously how you make an American football game. Imagine if those people had complete rights to control that, and people who used it in a manner they didn't want to, or didn't pay them a certain fee, were simply legally not allowed to use that game, show that game, talk about that game. This would be an interesting scenario, right? In esports, that is the case. The game is entirely owned by the game developer, assuming they're the ones that have the rights. It's actually treated more like something like a piece of art, a book, a movie, rather than a sport. This game developer can decide who can run tournaments. They can perhaps even claim copyright against someone who plays the game and shows it on YouTube. They can charge license fees for people to run tournaments within their game. Now, it's understandable why there's confusion here, because obviously it isn't exactly the same as making a ball or inventing the rules of football. In this scenario, you made a game, a computer game, which is clearly a piece of art. It's not simply a tool or an object. And within the context of that come a lot of other concepts that are understood. With that said, the rules on these sorts of things, while at the moment obviously there's a precedent, they're not as obvious because it's a new domain. That in some degrees you could make the case on shaky ground, because certain cases haven't even been tried in the world of esports and computer games in terms of some of these IP rights. But to this point in time, especially when you go into IP rights in the world of movies and music, these are secured and maintained by some of the biggest companies in the world, particularly media companies, and who have armies of lawyers looking to keep those rules within the current bounds of where they are and keep other people out from being able to share ownership or be granted some legal exception to use that factor in a way where you don't have to agree with the original rights holder or pay them in some way. Now, you look at the different esports and the extent to which the owner of those rights actually asserts and controls the sport differs from esport to esport. So in League of Legends, Riot effectively runs everything, and we saw that that meant in the early days of the esports side of League of Legends, it meant very little. They let all these tournaments run their tournament competitions. In fact, they were even paying those tournaments the prize purse. Later on, they made the LCS and shut down the third-party circuit, at least in terms of some of the teams playing there, and you could run it, but even then you had to get their agreement and pay certain license fees. Then you go over to Asia, where they had no influence at the time. In due time, they were able to take over the likes of Korea, which had its OGN champions and then had to become LCK, and then had on GameNet was showing the games that had to then become SpoTV and on GameNet, and mainly SpoTV nowadays. Then you look over at China, and okay, China hasn't been as directly affected and has a lot more wiggle room on being able to do things that aren't really sort of the Riot way, but that's because Tencent, the company, owns Riot, at least all the controlling shares, and as far as I know, and as such, they also effectively can bypass Riot in terms of how they run things in their native China. But Riot can absolutely shut tournaments down, can absolutely assert their rights and stop people being able to rival the LCS, to do things a different way in there, allow teams to go and, I mean, I guess it's tough on the team one, but in terms of being able to use the media aspects of the game in media and to promote your team, etc., they certainly have a lot of control over what you can do there. You look at Overwatch, again, Blizzard owns everything. You have to apply to run a tournament. In StarCraft 2, there was actually explicit rules that you couldn't run a tournament parallel to things like WCS, which is Blizzard's top tournament. There can be no third-party circuit unless Blizzard deems it acceptable, which apparently will be the case after Overwatch League for a lot of the Western teams. But even then, will they let the Western teams compete? Must you pay fees to them to compete in this league? Dota and CSGO obviously are owned by Valve, but in Dota, Valve was pretty hands-off early on, except the international. Then they introduced a few majors a year. Now they've actually incorporated and integrated all the other big tournaments to become majors and minors. And so now effectively they are asserting more control, but on a much lower and smaller scale than some of these other game developers, and as much as they're tending to just match and cooperate with you and still pick people to run these things, as opposed to being more top-down control like some of the people like Blizzard and Riot Games have. Obviously, we've seen times, though, where, for example, they stepped in and told ESL to stop getting Twitch accounts banned and doing DMCA takedowns of streams that were showing just the game of Dota 2 in the spectator client, not showing or restreaming the ESL stream. They were able to say, hey, these are actually our IP rights and we don't want you to do it anymore. So ESL had to back off on that. Whereas in a world where Valve said nothing and didn't look to these things, ESL seemingly would have probably won out on that political battle. In CSGO, very little control from Valve. Obviously, they mainly just choose who does the major and dictate some of the terms of the major and the payouts, etc. But that's about it. Now, the reason this is all significant, because at the moment you'd think, that's no problem, right? These game developers have elevated their esports. They put more money into it. They've brought in bigger outside influences, especially in the case of Blizzard and the Overwatch League. They've done so many good things for their games, right? I mean, in CSGO, we had the majors with now $1 million for each major, whereas in the old days of pre-majors, winning like 20,000 for first place was an amazing accomplishment, and very few lands had anything close to that. The problem here is many people in the esports scene who aren't game developers have essentially built their companies as houses built on sand. And when the waves come in, their houses can just be crashed away, destroyed. They'll be waved away into the sea. And when the wave goes back, nothing might exist. A game developer can come along tomorrow, tell a huge tournament organizer, I'm not going to grant you a license for this massive tournament. You've already booked out the stadium. You've already got the prize purse. You've already started talking to teams. But you know what? I'm not going to give you this one, actually. I've decided I don't want you to run this tournament. Sorry, you can't run the tournament anymore. Denying you a license. They can demand that someone can't use their property anywhere. They can't use it in videos. They can't use it as part of a name. Hey, we're an Overwatch team. We're a League of Legends team. This would impact tournament organizers running tournaments, teams and how they brand themselves, players even with their individual streams, and in the future, hopefully their own personal sponsors through their specific status as a player of a certain game. You think of a scenario like recently where ESL sold the broadcast rights for EPL to Facebook. Well, in this scenario, Valve could absolutely step in and say, those are our IP rights. So unless you somehow, within our license that you paid to us, got an agreement that you could sell on those rights, those are our rights, mate. Either we should get that money or you can't sell those rights. Those aren't your rights to sell. At the moment, they're hands off. They let people like ESL make their hay while the sun is out. The reason why this is the elephant in the room is because this very rarely really gets talked about. I mean, people understand, right? Riot owns the League of Legends, so if they want to do something with their game, you know, they can do something. But it's the elephant in the room in as much as it's not challenged really at the moment. No one really even conceptualizes that it can be challenged because IP rights, as I said, with the armies of lawyers and massive companies, much bigger than these game developers, have been maintained and sort of protected for a long time because it incentivizes the people who own those things not to let other people share in them or be able to use them without their permission or them making, you know, certain amounts of dollars on the cents on the dollar every time that's done. They want their cut. The reason, though, also why it hasn't been an issue is, as I said, it's perceived that those game developers are doing a good thing by asserting their IP rights in certain incidents. They are sort of seen as benevolent dictators or kings, and if you get on their good side, there's no problem, and they often will let you do things. And if they're making money and you're making money, they have no problem with you making money. You're paying your share, you're paying your license fee, you're using their branding, as in you're promoting them. They haven't been too tyrannical yet, generally. Obviously, in terms of Riot and Blizzard, on an individual level towards certain teams, there have been scenarios where they didn't let teams have sponsor names in their team name in the game. With tournament organisers, obviously, they don't let some tournament organisers run tournaments, but it's very rarely been massive level ones. You think of scenarios where, obviously, players have been punished in seemingly quite a tyrannical way sometimes, or people have been disallowed to do certain things. I mean, I think of the Spectate Faker one, for example, even though the API Riot claimed everyone could use. One of the reasons why you haven't really seen this be an issue yet is there's no point bringing this up or having this fight for most people at the moment. Most people don't have the real power in the world, you know, political power or the influence over all the rest of the scene to band everyone together, or the financial backing and logistics to fight a case like this over 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it might take, repeated cases, maybe going up to other courts around the world. Again, it would be a global initiative, presumably, in terms of how the IP rights were controlled in different countries and regions. We've seen it on a lower level when it was actually initiated by Blizzard in StarCraft Brood War, the first StarCraft game, the expansion for that, which was massively popular for a decade in South Korea almost solely. So what happened was Blizzard just ran it like a normal game. Esports wasn't a thing in the early days. They made the game. They probably thought it was cool that Koreans picked it up and were making it into something of a semi-national sport. And it was way bigger there than anywhere else in the world. And they sold many copies of Brood War, millions to Korea as a result of this. They probably thought everything was great. But what happened was KESPA, the Korean Esports Association, who control things over there, they came along, and along came a company who wanted to show StarCraft Brood War in Korea on a different channel, online largely here. And so KESPA said, you have to buy the broadcast rights for us or agree to the broadcast rights for us. We are the ones who grant the broadcast rights to OnGameNet and to MBC Game, for StarCraft leagues and for the Pro League. And the problem here is Blizzard correctly said, well, actually, those are our rights. We are the ones, as I said with the EPL example of Valve before, those are our rights, actually. So, first of all, you aren't allowed to sell those. Secondly, we decide who runs this. And thirdly, what's happening to all this money you're making off this? And so they initiated a court case. Now, the way that ended wasn't really something that I think necessarily was conclusive about this matter and set a real precedent, because a lot of the reasons supposedly as to why that court case didn't go all the way is factors like KESPA was open to settling, so they could still control some aspects of it. There was, I think, actually part of the StarCraft 2 Brood Wars transition was part of this, making a new relationship with Blizzard. Then you had the factor that in Korea, it wasn't like the United States of America, where probably someone like Blizzard would win the case quite easily. Instead, there was a sentiment in Korea of, these are Korean companies, and what they're doing is something that's Korean, and we created this, and it wasn't about you. That the sense was high officials had an incentive to want Blizzard to lose the case and to be in a position where it was much harder to fight. And so there was a lot of pressure on both sides to end this case, as they indeed did, but in kind of ominous manner, because it wasn't really decided one way or the other how it really, how you kind of, the cookie crumbled on that one. The thing is, though, the future of this topic will only become more and more important as we go through these different periods of growth and evolution, and as more money pours into esports. Because once the industry, and particularly people like tournament organizers who could become massive entities like the Premier League in football, like the NBA, like the NFL, okay, some of these people want to become those, But in the games that are controlled by the game developer, League of Legends, Overwatch, you can't, because essentially they own the IP rights. And so they can first of all decide if you can even have leagues. And also if they themselves, like in those games, have leagues, they're going to make sure their game is front and center. And you can't directly compete with them because they won't allow you to. Now, this is where in the future, once there's enough money involved in it, you'll start to see some traction on it. At the very least, discussion of it, at the very least, lobbying of it, pressure put upon these companies, put through court cases. And one day, I think actually, when you have massive amounts of finances ready to be put into huge scale ventures like an NFL, like a Premier League, I think you will actually see this battle pushed to the limit and possibly won by parties other than the game developers, which will then be the key aspect. Because even though, as I said, yes, a video game is very different from a book or a movie. You know, even though they share similarities in how they're treated right now, in this scenario, it's not like reading a book somehow would make you millions and millions of dollars and therefore somehow you'd owe it to the other person. Maybe on some grounds, but when we go to the sporting angle, which is where I think people will try to draw the parallels, the main reason you watch the sport doesn't have much to do with whoever invented the football or the basic rules of football. Part of why they watch now is people have built up things like connections to the region you're from, or a history of a club which has competed in that game, or the style of sport that that club plays, or the success that that club has had, or the skill level and entertainment factor that players for that club can provide. That would mean you might not even watch that club play if specific players weren't involved in it and their incredible skill with that ball. Not just the fact that they are playing with a ball. You couldn't just put any players in a stadium and get 80,000 people to go to whatever it is, the Bernabeu, and watch the European Cup final if it was just random players out of the pub. People wouldn't go. People wouldn't watch. Therefore, it wouldn't make that money. So the argument could be made, the money is made actually from the act of what those people do with the sport, with the ball, with the rules of the game. And so that is what I think people will push with esports. I mean, the argument is termed usually as what you're doing is transformative. Your performance with that object, it's the performance that is making up the majority of the value here. And so your performance is transformative of the other person's intellectual property into some new hybrid or some new thing entirely. And so the performance of players in game, of the players that teams own, of tournament organizers and their league structure and how they promote it and how they set it up, all these aspects will be argued to be a factor in where the value, which is the money, which Blizzard wants to either control or say we should have some cut of, or Riot Games, or any game developer really, is what will become the contention, the point of contention. So it won't be that it's just the game that's causing this. I mean, this is already the case in sports. Like, the reason why people will pay whatever it is, $1 billion, $800 million for a Floyd Mayweather fight has very little to do with boxing gloves, a ring, or the rules of boxing. It's much, much more. You'd argue, what, like 90% of it is to do with Floyd Mayweather or Manny Pacquiao or Conor McGregor, whoever he's fighting, and the spectacle of what that is, and then what they're going to do inside the context of the rules and with the gloves. But the gloves, the rules, and the thing, and two random people would never be able to get anywhere approaching even 98% of that revenue and overall money coming in. So would it make sense for the people who made the rules or the equipment to get most of the money, or to even be able to control if you could have the fight in the first place? Likewise with Messi or Ronaldo in football, Conor McGregor in MMA. There's a reason why these people break numbers and draw in massive amounts of people. And there's a context that involves the game and the rules, but that's a much, much smaller part. And they are clearly transforming those items through their play into something bigger that's bigger than that item. And in fact, to some degree, because it's performance, exists in the real world, but it's also the context of what it means in our minds, right? Now, the problem here is, obviously, to even know when this would be or how it would be done, you'd need some high-level lawyers. But if it ever is done, the elephant in the room right now of IP rights will become a game changer, because then it will mean that someone like an ESL could come along in the Overwatch scene and say, okay, Overwatch League exists, but you know what? I'm going to set up my own league, maybe on different months, maybe at the same time, and I'm going to compete directly with you. Maybe they'd be able to push the idea of, like, this is anti-competition within this game. We want to put in billions and create jobs and be in a scenario where, you know, we're creating this transformative act. Now you can put pressure on court systems, on governments, on legal bodies to help you. And obviously you grease the right palms, you get the right lobbying going. This absolutely could be possible. Certain precedents get set at a lower level. These can be spun and built upon into a bigger topic. So again, I don't know much about legal rights. I wouldn't claim to have any legal expertise, but this seems like an area that at the moment is fairly closed off. But over time, the amount of money and interest could be a crowbar to crack that gradually open. Perhaps it'll be shared, some hybrid system, eventually maybe wide open, and maybe the game developer can do whatever they want with their own tournament, their own game, but maybe they can't control other people. That's the IP elephant in the room. This video was made possible by Dean Tanglis, Sanity, Gman, Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Jerky's Minion, Anthony, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Travis T. Greb. Just like my man, a lot of people think you can't tell me nothing, but I've graduated from that mindset. And now it is possible to have influence over some of the people I have on my shows, some of the topics I cover, to ask me questions directly and get exclusive teasers for upcoming projects I'm working on. Unlock the code to the streets and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link below.